always love
I love it.
the dramatic countdown that they have at the beginning of the Twitches and the
It's so good.
the StreamYards. Like, also, I feel like I actually went to the effort to try and edit one, or and I made it pretty far to make a cool one. But I was like, no, I just want the cheesy StreamYard one. I was like, I could edit a really cool one, or
Great.
I could just do a cheesy one. Which
I mean,
would be,
honestly, lean in, right?
like lean into the queso at this point.
100%. It's the shit that people remember, right? Like, that is the stuff that sticks with people, is the, like, cheesy, like, super simple, fun shit. The thing that makes people feel away, for sure.
Like, and if you're not doing that, then are you really having fun? Can you have fun? Do you know how to have fun?
Exactly.
The best thing, a little tangent here. So I got into comedy a little bit over a year ago now. I've been doing stand-up and sketch writing, but the best thing I've been really enjoying about doing comedy has been a lot of the, how do you make fun of yourself? And they're really into, like, if you ever go to formal comedy, they're like, it has to be real. And you can tell when people aren't real.
Yeah.
And then it's all of a sudden like, ooh, cringe, yikes. But I guess to go on a completely different tangent, let's talk about the non-real today. But first, who the heck are you? Thanks for joining me. And like,
absolutely
introducing yourself, and also good to see you face to face again.
Yeah, it's good to see you too.
The like,
it's been
pandemic world,
literally years because of pandemics, and that fucking sucks.
Yeah, I think it's literally been years since. Yeah, and then internet. Like, I'm always like, hey, DM, what up, life?
Yes. Which is pretty much like 80% of my relationships anymore, which is, I think, both sad and also a little necessary, and life is like that sometimes.
I kind of feel like it's the best barrier. So, like,
a little bit.
Like, I don't really actually want to talk to people, but like the internet.
But yeah, so it's good to see you. It's good to see you too. My name is Patrick, PC Perini on all of the social apps. And I am a number of things, most relevantly and sort of most recently a writer and DM. I host the D&D actual play podcast, and I say that with like really big air quotes because it's basically an unscripted audio drama called Unbalanced Encounters, which you can find at unbalancedencounters.com, and where kind of we do the show, and sort of in the broader community that we built around it, sort of the Discord and the Patreon and so forth, we do all manner of things, sort of tabletop role-playing game, writing, improv, storytelling, and world building. And so that is my shtick. That's my spiel.
Yeah, and it's been, so first off, if you're not listening to Unbalanced Encounters, you should probably start listening because it is totally fun, totally great, totally cool, and you're totally missing out if you're not following or listening because it's a great storytelling podcast. You've done it really well. And the thing that I love about some of these D&D podcasts, and D&D myself, if I do venture into that, is the way that it kind of takes you in. It's very stress relieving because it's like, it's the same thing that reality TV does, is like it takes you into a different world.
Hell yes.
It's
ironically, like, for reality TV.
Yeah, yes. It's like, right? It's like, it takes you into a different world, and it's like, I could be 90 Day Fiance, or I could be fighting elves and gnomes.
Fight a fucking gnome. I mean,
fight a fucking gnome.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I think that is kind of a lot of people, like, it. At the end of the day, tabletop role playing is an escapist fantasy, right? And I think that a lot of people sort of look down on that as like, oh, what do you have to escape from? And it's just like, fucking, like, have you?
Do you look outside? Are you not a hermit? Have you left a cave or been on the internet at some point in the last?
I think that has obviously, with the pandemic, right? That's obviously become super acute for a lot of people, and it is kind of evolved and metastasized into like a primary socialization mechanism for a lot of people. But also, I think there's something more fundamental than that, right? I think that tabletop role-playing games are like a structured and slightly commodified way of, sort of facilitating something that is as old as human communication itself, which is storytelling, right? Sitting around a campfire and just bullshitting with your friends, coming up with interesting narratives for your friends that are meaningful to you as a group of human beings alive on this planet, right? Like, there are so many good kind of quotes and essays and schools of thought from Neil Gaiman and Tolkien and all kinds of authors and writers that say that, like, the fundamental human thing to do is to imagine, right? It's to project into worlds that don't exist. And I think that D&D is just like a really good fucking way to do that over Discord, right? Like,
but it's like not even just like Discord. Like the thing that I joined D&D and I played in college and like undergrad and like learned, and I think the thing that I really enjoyed about it is it's like it takes a couple of the big buckets of like, fantasy escapist getaways that I really enjoy. You have the narrative and really strong story writing. Like there's nothing worse than getting into a D&D campaign when it's predictable. But it's like a good book, right? If you have to predict, it's like it's the same reason I hate superhero movies. That's my spicy take. I hate superhero movies because it is the same narrative plot line every time. And I'm just like, But D&D, it's like, oh, there might be a new plot line. There might be a new thing happening. There might be, and it can change based on the different factors that you throw about it. So kind of a breakdown here. If you haven't played D&D or you're new to a tabletop RPG role-playing game.
Yes.
How would you describe that for someone?
So I've seen so many people kind of try to do this, and there are so many different takes, and I think that there isn't a canonical way to encapsulate what is a very individual experience. But I think one of the best ones is just like it is a game at its core where the kind of the entity that's running the game master is an individual, or the game itself describes a circumstance, and you, pretending to be a character, describe how you would react to that circumstance. That could be dialogue, it could be action, it could be sort of magic or intrigue, whatever you want it to be. You describe how you want to react to that situation. Then the game tells you how to facilitate whether or not you're successful in that, and that yes ands the story into, okay, you did succeed and therefore, or you failed and therefore the next thing happens, the situation adapts and you react to it again. You're forming this kind of core loop of telling a story together and having that be, again, kind of facilitated by this set of rules that is constantly pushing the game forward.
Well, and I think the thing that I also kind of enjoy about this kind of fantasy world and how it comes together is it's very much like what you make of it. And they do have like pre-written ones, or what they call D&D one-shots, which is like a campaign in a day or a campaign in a minute that kind of gets started. But there's also, you can make it pretty complex and players can play together for literal years. Like literally years. There's a friend of ours, they run a board game bar.
Cool.
And they like have D&D nights and drop-ins, and it's like, how do you meet new people? How do you engage with new people? How do you, so on and so forth, but also just making it a really introductory thing. And I think it's like the way that we've really leaned into world building and kind of this narrative storytelling is really cool, but sometimes it can be really easy to overcomplicate it. But breaking it down, like what is world building, just to get started? We keep mentioning it. We've said it.
Yeah.
World building. Drink every time you hear world building. But like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a concept that, like, as like a practice, it's kind of earliest, sort of best kind of encapsulated in writing, right? This is a thing that anytime anybody sits down to write a story that is not set in our exact world, which is almost all fiction, has to, kind of endeavor to do. They have to come up with a new world that is different from ours in some way. For something that is as intricate and sort of interactive as Dungeons and Dragons, world building can get far more big and sprawling than it might for example, a short story, right? Where you have to think about the way that everything from religious systems to physics to magic systems work within the context of your world. What geographies exist, what politics exist, what mechanisms of equality exist, what mechanisms of power exist. You can pull as much of it as you want from kind of reality all the way through to fabricating everything from scratch. And that forms the setting in which you eventually play your game and tell your stories.
Well, I think we often hear about it in like these, when we hear of lore or realms or kind of everything that I really think of is kind of, we talk about the like Harry Potter lore or the, Marvel universe or so on and so forth of like what's going on in each of these realms. But what is that like? How do we start to think about it? And what does that like when we start to build it? I think we start with the kind of the basics. Like, are you dealing with wizards? Are you dealing with gnomes? Are you dealing with
genres are helpful here?
Genres. Like, and like obviously, I guess you could probably say like as you get more skilled, you can combine genres. But and I see Collins in the chat. Actually, he was one of the DMs for my
oh hell yeah.
Yeah, he was one of the DMs that like played. Actually, no, he wasn't my DM. He was on a campaign that we went on together. But
Nice.
It was really exciting to kind of see this world building to come together, like picking the genres. So I think step one, if we're gonna build a fantasy world, I think can we attempt to build a fantasy world in say 48 minutes? Unscripted.
Yeah.
Let's try this.
100%.
We've got a Google Doc here. So I guess if you're
Yes.
following along, we can just drop it in. Let's just have some fun and build a world together.
Uh-oh. Did I freeze or did you?
Internet.
Am I back?
I think we're back.
Are you back?
I think I'm back.
Great.
Internet, we love.
Yeah. It's fantastic. Cool. Yeah, no, absolutely. You could definitely build a world in 45 minutes, right? Like, no question at all.
Yes. And I love this comment from Colin. If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. And I guess like one of my favorite fantasy lore worlds is definitely the Hitchhiker's Guide, the Galaxy lore.
Hitchhiker's Guide is
just like my favorite because it's just like the thing I love about it is it's such an unpredictable world. Like a towel is the most essential thing that you need when you go on an adventure.
This is such a good example of like the different ways because you have that is a great example, and I think kind of we can pull the cultural touchstone of like Tolkien as another kind of very divergent mechanism of world building, right? Where it's like, hey, I want to start by thinking through all of the ways that like trees and languages work in this world versus I want to make a couple dumb jokes and then I want to make those jokes make sense. And there's not like a right way to start. They're both completely and equally valid. Brian has just chimed in, a world doesn't have to be the size of a world. And I think that is an extremely sage piece of advice, right? Like when we were working on the world for, sort of Unbalanced Encounters for the first season rally, like it started as a logging village, right? And it was like, hey, a logging village needs like trees around it. And so there's a logging village in a forest. Let's start there, right? And figure out what this place looks like and why you people are here. And once you start to figure out why the people are here, you can start doing kind of what I like to do, what I prefer to do, which is a lot of character first world building, defining the world around the paths that these characters have taken to kind of become on screen at the moment. But yeah, you can absolutely and should, I think, often start pretty small for your worlds. Which I think gets back into genre, right? Because like you think about like the world that you need for a space opera, and I would probably argue that A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy falls under space opera. That's canon.
I feel like that's a good space opera up there with Star Wars, which is
exactly.
Star Wars. Yeah, like so. I think like so if you're following along, I'm gonna just open up this art of world building. If there's anybody in the audience that has a great genre, should we pick a genre?
Yeah, let's pick a genre. I mean, you've got obviously like. High fantasy, I think, is something super interesting. I'm a big fan of playing around in kind of low fantasy settings, sort of magic focused, but not necessarily kind of the whole elf, kind of high elves style thing. Sci-fi is definitely a space to play around in. Westerns are a tremendous amount of fun that I've played with. Sort of noir or heists, any film genre that you can think of is a great place to start.
Yeah, I'm a big like psychological thriller and did a D&D like one shot recently that was like very psychological thrillery, but like I love like, Black Mirror or I've been really into The Patient in Hulu lately, which is like the guy that I always forget his name. I always want to call him Adam Sandler. It's not Adam Sandler, but my brain just like that's the connection it makes and I can't remember the actor's name. But look up The Patient on Hulu and tell me what actor it is because I don't know what it is. But for genre, I think we can build a magical world. Unless anybody in the audience has a great takeaway or a great genre that they want to dump in, but like I'm here to we can noodle around here. I'm here for, we can do some like, even thinking like narrative arcs. And actually, I'm going to drop another reference in.
Go for it.
There is a book that I love for narrative writing. That is like, it is basically a Bible that is the book of narrative writing, and it has almost all the traditional narrative structures that you can have in storytelling. And that's awesome. Kind of an academic book. I'm like, it has a maze on the cover. I see the book. It's sitting on it's sitting on the shelf in that room over there.
Yep.
And of course, I'm like, can't find it.
Can't remember what the name is. Love it.
Yes?
Hero's Journey.
Oh, the book is called Hero's Journey. That's the voice off screen, aka my husband. But it's called The Hero's Journey.
Yes, classic.
Can you tell we took the same narrative writing class from the same professor? Thank you, Paul Mitchell. But it was this great book, but it is essentially just like the Bible of narrative storytelling. And it has all the different narrative arcs you can take. It has all the different it's writer's journey and mythic structure. So if you ever are needing to like see how it goes, and I know I dropped the Amazon link in there, but please buy it from an independent bookstore or get from your local library because screw Jeff Bezos.
Humanly possible.
Yep, as much as humanly possible because we understand intersectionality and privilege and et cetera, et cetera. But if we have a good, I think a space opera, psychological thriller, and that's just what came to mind.
I mean, yeah, absolutely, right? Like, you start to think about space opera, psychological thriller, and I mean, again, there's no right way to sort of, kind of do this, but my impulse would be like, where are we starting, right? Like, when the camera turns on for the first time, what are we looking at? Are we looking at an individual who is, sort of alone in a circumstance? Are we looking at, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, something far more Star Wars-y, where it's like big and bustling and there's a lot of action, kind of, a lot of human interaction happening right away. What do we want the scope of that to be?
Ooh, that's a good question. Because like when you say space opera, you could literally mean all of space.
Yeah. Or
you could also mean, I think space opera, we really think of the heroics, the good versus evil, the interplanetary disaster. I almost like my personal favorites, and just throwing this out there, unless anybody here listening in has an idea or you have an idea. I love when they're rooted in reality, where you start watching it and it's like, oh, it's a normal everyday scene. Like very much like where you see it and everything's normal. And then all of a sudden you're like, gravity doesn't actually work here, or we're actually on Mars, not Earth. And it just looks like Earth these days.
I mean, again, we start with that. We start with that being an impulse that we think is really cool, where it's like, hey, we want to start in a place where it looks a lot like Earth, maybe some sort of terraformed kind of circumstance. And then I think it helps to think about kind of what you want that initial conflict to be, right? And, when you say, hey, this looks a lot like Earth, my immediate thought is like, we could go, sort of as psychological as like, what does it mean to live in a world that is terraformed, where like the experience is sort of in the uncanny valley of living on Earth, right? Where like sometimes the gravity fails, and like what does that do to the body and mind and social systems, right? That could potentially be an interesting central conflict, or we could go like entirely in the other direction and go super camp and be like, there's something living in the subterranean caves beneath this terraformed environment. Like, what is it and why is it making our life difficult, right? Like anything in that space, you find the central conflict, and I think that really starts to give you the tone of what you're looking for.
Exactly. And one thing that I like about, and this is something I picked up through narrative writing and journalism, is like central conflict can be internal or external. And so when I've done this, it's like sometimes it's been, and I don't know if you have a best practice of like when should you rely more on internal for Gixby world building, or when should we rely on external? Because it's like,
want, baby.
Yeah, it's like, but like I think the big thing is like for internal conflict, it can be even something as little as like you don't know that you're on this weird terraformed Earth, but everybody else knows, and it's like, are you figuring it out for the first time? Or it's anytime I think of those internal conflicts, it's anyone's of like, oh my goodness, I was transported and I have to go figure out everything, because you're not everybody was transported, but and it's usually first person narratives that you hear these kind of story terms.
Yeah.
You can also have the external conflict, which is kind of like that you said, of like, oh shit, all of a sudden gravity got flipped off and how do we handle this situation? But yeah, let's go. Do you have a preference on a type of conflict?
I mean, not particularly, right? And I think that my process is usually a little bit of like, what aesthetics am I trying to emulate from the drop? Again, for, kind of Rally, a big, sort of a big motivator was Princess Mononoke. I was just feeling like I wanted to sort of explore that, like, the folly of man versus nature conflicts a little bit, right? And like, kind of explore the kind of high modernist fallacy of the idea that you could conquer nature, right? I thought that might be a particularly interesting place to play around with. But I've done games. I did a post-apocalyptic game set in sort of mid-century the mid-century American South at one point, where it was far more kind of man versus man in the wake of a flood, right? And I just liked the aesthetic of like, kind of what if "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" was a post-apocalyptic experience, right? Like, I don't have a particular preference. It's usually very aesthetic first, and kind of like what what tone you want this world to sort of inhabit. Thriller to me generally seems pretty like heavy. But again, you could do thrillers that are like Alien's a thriller, and I would say that Alien is very much just like it's campy as shit.
It's campy as shit, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, and one of the things I want to double down on this aesthetic is like, this is where you get to have the fun. Like, you get to paint the characters in your mind. Like, I've seen people do mood boards for D&D, which is like really great to see.
I do mood boards all the time for my shit, for sure.
Or even I've seen people who find their sound effects, like what playlist would this character listen to?
That's fun. That's fun.
The other question, which I actually stole from UX World, which is like, is the one that I've stolen is, if your character was at a party, where would they be? And that's a great way to kind of frame and what would the party look like? So what does a standard party look like in this environment? If you're having friends together on a Friday night in this world,
that's very good.
What does that look like? And then it's like, because every, like, the standard D&D trope is like, okay, a bunch of people meet at a bar and you're in a town and you meet in a bar and they're local tavern and we're off on an adventure because we met some random folks at a bar. And I feel like that's a very standard D&D trope you can get into. For this very realistic, hyper-realistic or not realistic space camp world we're living in, I think the starting point, I really like this kind of primary conflict of like, the world seems real, too real, something not right. But we don't quite know what. I'm just going to call it like, and that I would sum that up in like a little fish out of water. Ooh, we love these. We love the resources.
That's very good. I also just dropped literally the mood board that we did for Unbalanced Encounters, because I figured that might be relevant.
Oh, hey, good to have you here, Ramon. So we're talking about world building here.
Yeah.
So and if you're following along and you want to build world with us, you're welcome. We got a Google Doc. We're going to build an imaginary world, and we've got 36 minutes.
I think very much in the same universe as like, kind of what style, kind of what primary conflict you want here, or what kind of mood board you want to pick here. Like, you can also start just looking at like what sort of media does this sort of imitate, right? Like, is this more Alien or Moon, right? Like, is this more kind of Dune or Hitchhiker's Guide, right? Like, where does this sort of sit? I'm curious, like, do you have thoughts on kind of that axis? Kind of where does it fit?
Yeah. Oh, I guess I've never like really thought about this in this quick like 30-second world building. If we're gonna build this, I would say I really lean towards the world building that is very much it's almost like hyper realistic. Like, did you ever watch Pushing Daisies, the show that like unfortunately writer's strike killed?
No, I can't say that I did.
Oh my goodness. Pushing Daisies, do watch it. It's on Hulu. The writer's strike killed the show, but it's like, and it actually has a very large Reddit community of people being like, screw you, writer's strike. It was like a really great show that shouldn't have got canceled, but it's almost oversaturated, like super charmy, but it's about a guy who can make the dead come back to life.
Oh,
so it's like this like hyper morbid, but like almost like manic pixie dream girl meets morbid.
Yeah, okay.
So it's like bright colors. There is a very, it's, you know, this was 2008. So like very manic pixie dream girl character. This was peak Zoe Deschanel era. So yeah, you get this, like, I'm going to put Manny Pixie morbid. I feel like that can be a category.
I like
styling.
That. That's actually very good. I like that quite a bit because that tells us like, you know, we want things to be familiar. We want them to be almost like eerily familiar, with just a little bit of subversion of those things. You know, so I think that tells us like a lot right there, right? Like if we are dealing with an environment that has been created to very closely mirror what we would consider to be sort of the present, right? Like very closely mirror life in, you know, kind of you know, sort of life on Earth in you know, sort of the 2020s, right? And so like then that begets, to my mind, a bunch of questions. Is this are we dealing with you know, kind of an enclosed you know, kind of space station? Are we dealing with a planet, right? Like how big is the area that we get to explore kind of at first thrust?
Ooh, first thrust. I always think like the stereotypical white, like when I think of manic pixie dream girl, I'm like, you're either in a studio apartment with your 5 best friends, a la very New Girlish, overplayed trope, or you have the white picket fence. And don't know if you ever played the Hitman game or the game series or familiar with them, but they have a whole level that's like an assassin in a neighborhood level. And it's kind of a weird, creepy, like, good. It's so good though. And it's like, you can take people out with a lawnmower and you can take people, and it's like very like everyday thing. So it's like, I'm kind of leaning into this like white picket fence world that we're existing.
No, that's very, very good. And
so
that gives us, again, like a sense of scale, right? Like this has to be a space where we can talk very seriously about like acres of space that's kind of been dedicated, right? And I think that's kind of super, super meaningful. So we've definitely identified like what are the, you know, kind of that there is something askew about this world, right? Like that is a big part of the central conflict. What do we think those things are? What do they look like? Even if we don't necessarily know why they are that way or how they work in its entirety, like what are some of the sort of inciting actions that draw us into that central conflict?
Ooh, so I've been very into, this is maybe my doom scrolling academic brain. So I actually am going to get into my, you know, I studied Lyme disease misinformation people, and I was shocked about how many people make money on medical and misinformation. Cries a little bit. Yeah. That was a really interesting tangent. If you want to like cry a little bit about the state of our American healthcare system, some more, look it up
all the time. Trust me.
Yep. But one of the things that I really enjoy is kind of this world of, what is this context when the people were the conspiracy theorists were right? Like all of us, I'm going to assume that like we're all thinking smart people here. You never know some days. But like you wake up and it's like, what if QAnon was actually right?
Well, unlikely, but
very unlikely. But that's also the terrifying thriller part.
Well, okay, so that tells us a ton, right? That tells us that like someone is behind this and is orchestrating things to work in a certain way for some benefit, right? So then we get into the question of like, you have been led to believe that you are alive and on Earth circa 2020, right? In the 2020s, or at least an aesthetic that is equivalent, right? Who is benefiting from that lie and why, right? Like what are they doing behind the scenes that benefits them to have you believe that piece of fiction?
I'm like writing this down. This is like the setting what do they call it when I'm like blanking the name, but it's like the setting action, the rising action here.
Yeah.
Rising action here. You've led to believe, reading my narrator voice, you've led to believe that you're alive and you're on Earth. Yeah. And so sometime in the 2020s, someone has just created your existence.
Right. And that is a lot of work to do, right? Like why. And you know, again, there are so many potential answers to this. Anything from corporate profiteering, which I know is a very well-worn trope, but always a good one.
Always a good one.
To you know, kind of very matrixy, literal physical, you know, kind of harvesting of bodies to some of my favorite, which are just like this is, you know, kind of Fallout touches in this world a little bit. You know, there are a couple of good sci-fi films that I like that do this as well, which is just like you're part of a program that just ran longer than expected, right? Like the U.S. government set something up 100 years ago, and here you are, and the access to the original information of the people who are running the thing just aren't around anymore.
Ooh, what if we go sad? I'm like doubling down on the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. Like we can go, let's go sad and maybe say like, what if the creator of this world was just really lonely? Like,
I mean, that is bizarre and depressing.
Weird.
And
like it's just like instead of like I imagining him being like Sims, but like they were his friends, but he was living out his world. Like, you know, there's all that like the world is a simulation thing, but like what if it really was just a dude being Sims?
Okay, so this is a question for you. Do the people of this world, do the sort of central characters of this world, do they exist or are they simply simulated?
I think that's a good question for them to figure out. I mean, I gotta figure that out myself. So you could go either way.
You don't necessarily, you don't necessarily want to color in every angle of this, but I think that there is an element of like, is this a computer simulation or is this a physical space? And if you still don't want to necessarily answer that question, it leads to what I think is a very important thing, which is like the person who set this up, right? What is their access to power in this world, right? Like, are they literally the programmer of this simulation, or are they like a deranged quadrillionaire that set up an isolated satellite, right? Because that's a very like the level.
Those are very different.
They're very different.
Very different. I actually like this idea of it being a physical, real world. Like he's kind of like the Good Place, where you can just build it, like spin it up and be like, I built a human, bro. What's up? We can do that whole like it's a real world. They're a real boy.
Okay, so I think that's a really really good stake to put in the ground, and I think that we have this sort of unpainted corner of like who is the person who is behind this, and I don't particularly think that we need to get more concrete about that, but I do think that a big open area in your sort of world map that you would want to define at this point is like, what does the world beyond this place look like that would allow someone to have access to resources to do this as a fucking hobby? Because like immediately in my mind, like that is an individual owning a country level of power, and that does happen in the world. You can look to like Monaco as like a real place that is technically owned by an individual that is like, you know, and what does that imply for sort of the greater world? You don't need to answer any of those questions, but be very aware that that's an empty space that you can start to paint in as you tell your story, play your game, right? Like there's a mystery there that you can color in with more detail as you go.
Yeah, I think that's a really fun thing is like, and just to want to call it out, like if you are building world, it is important to kind of like identify your empty space. And this is something my husband and I talk about a lot with, we were talking about it with these kind of the remakes of, I never actually watched Game of Thrones. So don't ask me, but
sure.
Like other series, like I think of Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. Like I loved that series, or Weeds, or even the Star Wars universe in this, but like Star Wars universe, like one thing that I really appreciate about what they're doing in the Star Wars universe right now is they have identified what is canon. And so you have like your canon, but then they like don't really screw with canon. Like it's actually really fascinating. For the most part, they don't screw with canon.
Yeah.
And it's really cool. Like,
small.
but like they have like The Mandalorian, which is a spin-off series. Which adds to the lore and adds to the canon, but you're not having to go back and go, wait, but they have been really good in this. Like the writers of Star Wars have been really good about identifying their empty space to know what is happening, who is going on, how can we handle this in the future.
And you will have more carve out spaces for that as you start to fill in, especially the people of the world. You know, The Mandalorian is a great example of like as soon as you introduce Boba Fett, you introduce an order of people that he is related to that you can then start to color in. And what part did they play in the world? What is their history? Where did they come from? And when you're working with something as big as a space opera, you do have a little bit of room to kind of spread out and like say in the distant corner of the universe at this point in time, this is who they were, and explore that sense of history. So I think, like character drives a lot of that, but even from kind of central storytelling perspective, that first thrust of what you're kind of looking at, like be aware of where your empty spaces are, because they're tools, right? They are the places where you can start to like string together the red threads in the background to make shit make sense that maybe appears disparate in the foreground, right? And that space is really, really important, especially for something like a psych thriller.
I like this. I like as we kind of kick these off. Yeah. I think that's really an interesting one. So I think it's like one of the first things that you said is like, what is that thing that we can grow, and how did this dude end up with this power? And I kind of like, I'm a big fan of like when it was just like a whoops, we forgot accident, because like how true is that sometimes? Like, when you mentioned Monaco, you actually reminded me of, there is a sovereign independent nation inside of the United States. I don't know if you know that. That is a very obscure trivia fact I know. Really? I've actually visited it. It is the Republic of Molossia. It is in Nevada, of course.
Yeah.
But their official currency is cookie dough. I wish I was bullshitting you.
That's pretty good.
But like, I'm like, I like this idea that it's like, yes, it was like a really big deity, but like, out of all the deities, he's kind of like the lonely one. Like, there's like an evil deity and maybe like we could have this whole alternate universe of these deities. Yeah. But like, he's the one who like got the leftovers. Like,
that's actually potentially very good. And I think that you don't want to get too specific about who he is and how he works, but I like this vagary of like powerful entity, right? Maybe it's magic, maybe it's money, maybe it's sci-fi, and who knows if there's a meaningful difference, right? But this idea of like the scraps, right? Like this is somebody's like hobby project pieced together, the equivalent of like the sad guy in his basement working on his model trains, right?
Yeah.
Like, I like that. I think that's interesting. Keeping that in mind, what are the cracks in the facade that we think are important? What are the ways in which a person could become aware of the fact that this is distinct from our world?
Ooh, I think that's a good question. Well, first off, you mentioned hobby project, and how many of us, especially if you have ADHD like me, pick up a hobby and then you forget about it 2 weeks later, and you had this really great idea and you bought a domain name, then you didn't touch it, and now you have a bunch of domain names, and then you get this bill and it says your domain name's about to renew. And it's like, oh, shit. Yeah. So it's like what is the equivalent? Like if you were my domain name that got purchased after I had a really great idea one time, what would be the fact that you knew that I abandoned you?
I mean, right, and that's kind of tough, because I think that you have to be cognizant. You have to really sit down and kind of think about like, hey, what are the things that are true about you that were handed to you, right? Because like so much of who we are is either self-determined or broadly culturally determined, right? And very little of like our specific things were just like handed to us by an authoritative individual. And so, I mean, I'll put it as a question to you: are there things that you could think of that would maybe like fit with things that were just handed to you? And if not, what are the things in this world that would be just handed to them? I could think of like, I mean, there's like social security numbers and stuff, right? But like, what
everybody's social security number in this world is the same. It's like 0001.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Potentially. Like I think that that's certainly an element, right? That's certainly an element. And that's actually, that gets into some interesting stuff where it's like you could do some red herrings around simulation versus actual like real, like as people start to realize the cracks in the facade, they're questioning whether or not it's a simulation, because this kind of thing happens in programming all the time where it's like, hey, I didn't build the thing to divvy up individual social security numbers. Instead, what I did is I hacked together a different way to handle social security payouts that use like a different identifier, and they're just not related systems anymore, right? And so like maybe he put together the Social Security thing, the like retirement payout thing before Social Security numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this may not be the one example, but I think that there are lots of places here where you could start to think about like maybe everyone in this world has like an automatic identifier that they don't know where it comes from, right? Or maybe they have you know, kind of the flip side that you brought up, like maybe they have you know, sort of an ID that is that they're told they should keep secret, right? Very much in that Social Security like space. But it's just all the same one, right? They're just all keeping it secret out of like shared cultural habit.
Ooh, I kind of like, I'm like jotting these down, but as we start to think about these cracks in the facade, I'm like,
Yeah.
you're giving me the ideas from the software world, and it's like, you know, you have the features versus bugs, and it's like, how many times like have you put a bug in something and you can't find it? And it's like, until you like months later, you're like, oh, never updated that. And it's like all of a sudden updates happen like on a whim, or you forget to take your Adderall and get sucked in this hobby again, like
right, potentially
for 3 hours.
I think there's a sort of great you know, kind of there's a great forcing function here, you know, kind of a thread that I just went off of, which is like you know, think about the way that people talk about like when, you know, kind of scientists discover like a new kind of frog, right? It's like, hey, new frog just dropped, right? Like, what if that was actually a patch? Which then makes me think about like, hey, what happens to people who try to go out into the world beyond the boundaries of this place, right? Like, what does that look like? Because if this place was constrained in size, in order to make the world feel full, you would genuinely need to like drop content updates, right? You would genuinely need to drop like, hey, like, you know, even if it's just a you know, kind of a CNN post saying, hey, we discovered this new thing, and there's nothing to back that up, you have to at least have the facade of that happening, right? And so my question is like, what happens when people try to investigate those things and push beyond the boundaries of this? Do we know? Do we need to know up front?
I think it's kind of like I get very much like you know, did you ever read The Lottery, which is the book about people like choosing, I don't want to spoil their thing. Read The Lottery, and it has a great plot twist at the end, but it's a great book. Read it. It's a classic.
Yes. If you I'd be surprised if you didn't read it in school, but read it again. It's very good.
Yeah, read it again. It's like a good morbid tale if you need that. But Lottery, great book. Anywho, but like what is that like thing that like you expect, but like I think you kind of got me going with like a new frog just dropped, but like instead of snow it's dust collecting. Like, and it's like this idea of like dust bunnies collecting because he hasn't touched his side project, aka World, in a few years.
I think there could be some really cool stuff in like subtle weather differences where like snow is, they call it snow because that's the language that the intended simulation has built into the expectation, but it's just not snow, and it takes everybody some time to like figure out that that's weird, right? I think that's a great example. You also brought up The Lottery, which is like, I think there's a great example of to answer sort of my question, that you know, you could potentially have anybody who gets too curious disappears, and that could be a very positive thing, right? Like they get like they win a cruise and just don't come back. Right.
It's like that. I think it's like this idea of like, you know, what if you were escaped on a private island? Like, I got it. You know, it's like there's always this like there's someone I used to work with that is like, instead of calling it hit by a bus factor, like you should make your systems like you should call it the island getaway factor.
Like, the positive side of that. Yeah, exactly.
It's like we call it the island getaway. Like, what if they actually decided they wanted to like inherited a shit ton of money or something? And it's like, oh yeah, it's like I like the idea of like maybe it's like the island getaway. They if you go just disappears, aka goes on a private island. I like the idea of like it's like the cheesy postcard. It's like we get a cheesy postcard and like having fun here.
Yeah. That's very good. I like that a lot.
Cheesy postcard. I'm like, cheesy postcard sent to all the neighbors. And souvenirs. We gotta have clunky souvenirs.
Yes, 100%. 100%. Yeah, I think there's also potentially, if I were doing this from a TTRPG space, like those are the sorts of, that's the level of nuance that I would, you know, kind of endeavor to make subtly distinct, right? Like I would invent like just nonsense tourist destinations and have like kitsch for those tourist destinations, because your players are going to think like, oh, that's fucking weird, right? Like, and then you as the GM get to be like, no, that's a place you've heard of. And
Yeah,
the player starts to subtly get the distinction that like they are being conned, right? And
yep.
that dramatic irony is kind of what draws them in. So I think you can fill out as much as you want, sort of on that front, right? And I think that, kind of manufactured crises are another great way to sort of demonstrate, like, when people get too curious. Hell, as much as I don't want to give credence to actual literal conspiracy theorists because they have been killing people for the last several years, a global manufactured pandemic is not actually a bad way to keep people in their houses when they get too fucking curious. Like, that is a thing that you could deploy. I don't know that ethically it's a great thing to deploy, but it is a thing that you could deploy with the context of the narrative universe.
Yeah. I know. I always play with the rule no evil characters. That's kind of a rule that I've played with in my D&D group just because it's not fun. And like if you have a character that's like always sabotaging the fun. And so you can have chaos characters, but you can't have evil. So like we always do like, what is the chaotic one? Or it's like instead of a pandemic, it's like we can have holiday, like a global, instead of a pandemic, we have a holiday where it's like your holiday is watching reality TV for 5 hours a day. It's like religiously celebrated.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. And I think that sort of that gets into a bit of a side conversation that isn't specific to building this world, but like is I think very, very important, which is that when you're world building, you do have a responsibility to be aware of the political implications of your world, right? And I will give you kind of a great, for instance, because this spans beyond just giving conspiracy theories air and kind of lending effectively, even if it's very small, in a very small way, platforming things that can be very dangerous to people, ideas that can be very dangerous to people. I think you also you owe kind of consideration and respect to all of the cultural tropes and defaults and biases that you are inevitably going to be leaning on. And I'll give you a great example. This is slight spoilers for the podcast that I'm working on, so if you're listening, congratulations. I have a character in that exists in the afterlife that has taken on kind of a level of servitude, and that servitude does kind of visibly look like how we see servitude enacted in the vast majority of history, which is almost always an oppressive relationship, right? Like it's almost always either slavery or wage slavery. Very few people who have access to privilege and power put themselves voluntarily in a position of servitude. And in doing so, I needed to make very, very clear that this was a voluntary repentance for something. And I made that part of the way that the afterlife worked, which is that, like, purgatory effectively, right, was voluntary in this world. And that, to me, is very, very important because you don't want to just rely on the way that our world is shitty to create conflict. You want to be critical of who you're trying to villainize in your story and why you're doing that and in what ways you're doing that and the ways in which the world kind of contributes to that. Because at the end of the day, like, nobody really wants to experience fantasy racism. It's not fun, and it doesn't chances are you're not going to be able to add something to that story that historiographers haven't already covered in a far more nuanced and considerate way. So, like, just be careful, right? Be very careful about how you approach that stuff in your world.
And it's like the big thing with comedy and like the kind of the golden rule of comedy is like, don't punch down, but punch up.
Yep.
But also the other thing that it's like really important is understand that these need to come from real experiences. And so rely on your own personal real experiences. I kind of like the realistic horror stuff, but like we also need to be careful of accents because tabletop role playing can come with accents. And when we do that, like how do you do so respectfully and kind of not character blackface them? Be mindful of your own lived experiences. Be mindful in these world building that you're not just living out a horror fantasy. Watch The Patient on Hulu, because you can kind of see where these worlds are taking place and how this world building can have really damaging things. But like you got to be mindful of that. Ableism is another thing we see a lot in this, unfortunately, as well.
Yep. 100%. So necessary caveat there, be respectful, be considerate, and as much as you possibly can, punch up. That you have a little bit of authorial responsibility in your world building. Take it seriously.
Yeah, take it seriously. And also, like, it's way more funny to be tickled to death or something. Like, it is just way more campy and fun, and like, we should do that or something.
Sure.
And like, fantasy vacation places are way better than just like indentured servitude.
That actually vibes more with the theme. I think, most of the time you'll find that that's true. It'll vibe more with the theme to lean into the theme. So if you want to go manic pixie morbid, right? It's like that morbidity needs to be slim. That it needs to be almost saccharine in how up this world is. And so global pandemic, probably not the thing that would be deployed. Global vacation, that everybody gets to take off work and stay home, right? Probably closer to
Hacking day?
That manic pixie vibe, right? Like, give them a positive outcome because that's more thematically appropriate.
And I think, like, as we kind of, I'm like, 9 minutes, we've like got this little world going, but like, yeah, we're doing great. We could almost, like, at this point, like, I think we've got thank you for the political implications of world building. It's like the same thing as like no evil characters, because also it's just not fun if you're trying to play tabletop role-playing games and you have to go and then everybody dies. It's like, I don't want to listen to it. Like, that's me.
I for a narrative podcast, I agree. For a narrative narrative game, I agree. I think that, every table, every story is going to be a little bit different, and there are people who want to kind of explore concepts of difficulty and hardship and death. This is not like a blanket and shy away from those things, but it's also not a like, don't lean on them as a crutch because you feel like they're the easiest way to get somebody's attention or to make something feel meaningful, right? Like, the fun, positive up stuff and the lighter weight things are just as valuable and, potentially divergent from a lot of what we see, right? Like, you can play those sorts of games and they are no less meaningful. In fact, they're often more meaningful. So.
Yeah. So I'm like, if we're going to start on a journey, do you want to pick a character that we're going to set off on this world in this manic pixie morbid world?
And this is where I tend to sort of have, kind of the most fun because I love creating characters for situations and scenes. I will say, like, do we what is the intent of this world and this story? Is this going to be something that has a singular main character, a group of main characters? What does that feel like to you?
Ooh, I kind of like the where you're all kind of, what is it when it's called when you're all led by individuals, but you're all going in blind, so you don't know each other. Like, very much like the person in a bar. So like part of the fun is like discovering each other and being like, wow, this dude is always on vacation and comes back, but it's a little weirder each time, or this dude's never been on vacation.
Well, and but this kind of lies the question, and this is such an interesting thing from tabletop role-playing specifically, is like, you defaulted to the perspective of being able to other this dude, right? Right away. And so when you're writing a novel and it's from that first person perspective, that's the default. Every other person is othered. They're not you, the narrator. When you're playing a TTRPG, that's not the default, right? All of your players are the first person experiential narrator of the story from their perspective. And so you have to think about them, even if they have secrets from one another and are developing in interesting and divergent ways, you have to think about them as having privileged access to their own thoughts and experiences. And so I think, like, there's no right answer here, but which would you prefer? To define sort of a central first-person character, or to leave space for multiple?
Let's leave space for multiple. We can get weird. Let's have more weirdness. Yeah.
I mean, I think that, like, the question to ask then is, like, what brought them together, right? Why are they all in their space, in the shared space initially? Is it coincidence? Did they all win a single trip, a single camping vacation? Like, what brought them into the same space?
Ooh, I kind of like this one. I like this idea of their vacation got canceled. So, like, they're all super bummed that they didn't get zapped out of this world.
That's
like,
very
kind
good.
of an like, they're like, damn it, I'm not going to Forever Cheese Land.
That's very fucking good. That's very fucking good. And it really does kick off a tremendous amount here because like, um, what if this world is relatively constrained in size, there's not multiple continents and so forth, then the limitations of that are going to be run on, kind of quite a substantial level of subterfuge, right? Like you're going to have to figure out how to get people to not participate in those boundaries most of the time. And one of the strongest ways to do that is to effectively divide and gaslight them as individuals, right? And so like, you have a million different reasons as to why someone might not necessarily be getting on their plane. These 4 people maybe share the same one for this moment, right? Like, these 4 people all just missed their flight to, Michael Mouse's Cheeseland, right? Like,
I like this idea. They like all miss the flight at the airport.
And that's potentially where we start, right? Is just like an airport bar. They're all very frustrated that they missed their flight, and that allows us to sort of get that moment of figuring out kind of who they are as individuals and sort of why they are all there. Which might be very, again, if this world is sort of run on a lot of very divergent subterfuge, it might be very different reasons across all 4 of them.
Yeah, I think that's a great little thing. So I think we all kick off. If we open our curtain scene, we can even like, we've got a few minutes here left. We can even we can get this going. We can draw the curtains per se, and it's like we can zoom in. Camera is black. The screen flashes to a character of some persona, and they're like, "Bartender, I need your strongest whiskey because I just missed my flight to Mr. Mouse's Cheeseland because I was held up in security because my what's-a-who's-its were set off the alarm." And this security person has never seen a what's-a-who's-it before, and that's just depressing.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's interesting.
I like this actually because this kind of turns a trope on its head that could potentially be a lot of fun. Instead of making the bartender sort of a vassal, kind of an empty shell for reflecting kind of the main character, however many of these we're going to have, if that bartender could potentially become that person, right? One of these people. Maybe the bartender is the sort of person who finally has seen and heard enough coincidence to start to question things, right?
Ooh, I like him like being like the sage of the group, like
potentially, yeah.
Like we could have like because you could have in this world you could have the bartender as a playable character, right? Yeah, you don't have to make him an NPC, like. Yeah. You dictate it's your world. You get to mix it in the world of like.
This is another great example of something that happened in Rally, where like kind of initially as I'm spinning up the world, I'm like, hey, like you all 4 of you are going to be participants in this town, this logging village. What are your jobs? What are your relationships? And one of the player characters, kind of came to me and he was like, hey, who's in charge of this town? And I was like, well, I was going to come up with an NPC, potentially one of the founders. And he was like, what if it was me? And I was like, you want it to be you? Go write me the founding story of this town, and that's going to be your backstory. And he did, and it's Isaac Ekstrom. He's the mayor of, effectively the mayor. He's the leader of Rally, and that has led to such fascinating, dynamic gameplay where he feels so embedded in the world because we open the world with a place that is directly the consequence of his action. Right? And the more that you can give your characters consequence of action, the more they're going to feel like real entities in a real space.
Well, I think the other thing that is important that you did here, and kind of just wrapping this up here, because we're coming up on the hour, but the other great thing you did here is you empower the players. Like, I love world building in D&D, but I've had D&D people who are leading a D&D session always send us home with homework. And it's like, sometimes like I've had D&D people, like we had to bring a token we had to bring a token of admiration once, and it was like, okay, but it was like actually we had in the game show and tell, and then you had to come up with like, but we traded items, like everybody had a different item.
Oh shit!
Like, and it was like fun because you had to be like, here's this item that my character is bringing to a show and tell, or we've done talent shows, or we've done. But like bringing these real world elements, or like having your team or your help people bring people in the process, and it's just more fun because you get to do it together.
Yeah, but absolutely. And I think that kind of stuff, those sort of prompts are a blast, and it's such a good way to color in the world. My parting advice for world building is just like, as much as you want, just say something is fucking true, right? And then figure out why that makes sense as you go, because there will be a reason that you can uncover at some point. You don't need to suss out every last detail from first principles. As long as it feels aesthetically right and doesn't immediately contradict anything else that's true about your world, do it. Enjoy it. Have fun in the space, and then build as you go. It's a big undertaking. You will never be finished. Don't delude yourself to think that you can. Enjoy the process.
And guess what? There's no right answer. And I think that's the best thing, is it's your world. You get to have some fun with it. And so, but first off, thank you for joining. And if you listened in, thank you for being in for this hour. And this content will be live on my blog very soon, and it'll be chopped up in YouTube. So if you're watching back and you're like, I want to build a world building, it'll kind of be all diced up. And we actually might make this Google Doc a template. So if you need some basics to get started, it kind of outlined a template itself when I was taking notes. So we might just go from there. So thanks for joining.
I'm into it. And real quick, I want to give a quick shout out to anybody who's still in the chat. If you are into this kind of thing, if you play TTRPGs, if you are enthusiastic about the world building space, the podcast that I mentioned that I am for has a Discord. I'm going to post that link.
Do it.
And we do this kind of stuff all of the time. We have conversations about this stuff kind of floating all of the time. So the podcast is unbalancedencounters.com. There's a link to our Discord there. Link to the Discord in the stream chat. Come hit us up. Come hang out. Come talk to us.
It's super fun. They're super great. They're amazing. Do join. It is awesome. And you're awesome. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, Aaron. This was a blast. This is so much fun. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Happy Wednesday,
Bye,
all.
Everybody.
Woo!
Bye-bye.